Thank you, Eleanor. That was a great introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. I remember when I was asked to do this, I said, okay, somewhat reluctantly and unsure of what exactly I was facing. And then having a conference call with Eleanor and Olympia, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. Dave. Is Dave here? No? Oh, too bad. In the course of that conversation, lights were going off, and I was beginning to realize just how important you folks are to what we do. And I'm very happy to be here. So I do have a couple of disclaimers. First is, especially for the Vancouver crowd, because I lived in Vancouver and I know what it's like, I will first excuse me for a rather Toronto-centric presentation, because that's where I live and work mostly, and and having been the director of urban design for the city, I had access to a lot of Toronto-centric slides. So a lot of this is portable to many cities across Canada, and I have worked in almost every city, but every province but one, and every territory but one in this country. So maybe in the context of the conversation, we can talk about how might this be applicable to other places, and I'm all ears and interested in hearing from you as much as you might be interested in hearing from me. So, so I'll just excuse me for that somewhat Toronto focus. And I think without further ado, I'll just jump into this. My hope is that we'll leave a little bit of time, and maybe there might be some conversation. You have to excuse me for not knowing everything, and I think that I'm more of a generalist than anything. So there might be information that I'm going to be passing on to you that you know very well already, and that it is a crowd that has kind of a broad spectrum of knowledge of urbanism, and we'll see how it goes. So the three topics I'm going to talk about is the current and emerging trends that certainly are impacting urbanism and certainly in the field that I'm in and my day-to-day for the most part. And some of them are ones that are just beginning to really rear their heads in ugly and great ways. And I think that those are things that we have to look out for, and that we are constantly on the horizon keeping our eye on. The second is, I just recently submitted an article. I'm a contributor for the Ontario Professional Planners Institute Journal on urban design, and it forced me to think about this, and I'm going to present what I call the 21st century urbanism. And for this century, what kind of urbanism, what are we aspiring to? What is our goal in terms of what we're doing, rather than, we can talk about the little things here and there, but for the most part, what they all add up to. And it's really about a kind of overview, and what I suggest as a kind of new urban design agenda for new urbanism. And then the third point is, I've just made 4 propositions, really in many ways questions to you or to us in terms of what we're really grappling with. And I chose 4. There's plenty more, but they're kind of themed or they're kind of theme topics that many subtopics would fall under. So, what are the emerging trends? First is, and I think all of you are familiar with this, is this notion of urban renaissance. We're in very interesting times, and having both worked in the public and private sector in this part of the world, where we're seeing such an extraordinary amount of growth. It's really quite exciting. But where that growth is going and how it's taking place is vastly different than it was just 10 years ago. So we're in a context of a return to cities in droves, particularly in the GTA, where the downtown, for example, is growing at 4 times the rate of the rest of the GTA. Now, just 10 years ago, we were trying to figure out how to stop sprawl. So we're now facing a complete 180 in terms of the issues and challenges that we're now confronting. Not to say that sprawl is over, just to be clear, but it is a shift, and it's a big shift, and it's one that has a number of different kind of factors at play, whether it's the counter-sprawl growth policies that the Ontario government has implemented through the growth plan. If you're not familiar with it, some would say on one end of the spectrum a draconian approach to urbanism. On the others, especially from my school of thinking. It's been extremely helpful at curbing sprawl and helping to force municipalities to implement densities that are more sustainable in terms of growth. Now, it's not perfect, but it's been an important start. Demographics, we all talk about millennials and what are millennials and their preferences, and they're have been an important part of the market in terms of shifting change. Culture and market shifts, of course, which is related to that. Congestion and walkability. There are people who are finally getting smart out there and realizing that 2 hours a day each direction in a car to get to work is probably not a rational use of good use of time. So it's amazing that thousands and thousands still do it, but many, like myself and others, won't spend more than 10 minutes getting to work. I mean, if you're going to take more than 10 minutes to get to work, there's something completely absurd about the choices you're making in your life. Or maybe your time is just not that valuable. Who knows? Costs, everything's got a cost. Costs and fiscal constraints. Municipalities today can't afford to build at densities that they had once done. And I think there's a cost per capita between sprawl and urban places that I'll demonstrate in a second that really catches that point quite compellingly. So just in terms of the Toronto numbers, because this is really kind of the epicenter of where a lot of this, and to be clear, it's not the center of the universe. It's just the epicenter of this particular issue, which is the kind of growth shift that's going on. And I'm not aware of any American city and certainly a Canadian city that is seeing the magnitude in numbers that we're seeing here. So just to demonstrate in this chart, what you see in the orange blocks is the actual numbers of residential completions. And then what's really interesting is the squiggly line, which is actually the percentage of Toronto growth, City of Toronto, versus the whole GTA, which is where all the suburban areas are. And it's gone relatively around 20% the growth to almost hitting over 70% of that growth in the most recent years. So we are now capturing 70% of the housing starts in a city that's already built out. So all of this is happening in intensified forms. So the other important thing that's working for us is policy. So what you see here is an overlay of quite a few things. You'll see the transit, both existing and planned transit, and those that are actually underway and actually funded, which are the lines, of course. And then the bubbles and the circles, what you see there are the built, active, and projects under review. So the overall movement or kind of world in motion around development is in those bubbles. And they are concentrated where they ought to be concentrated, which is in what we call growth centers, areas that are targeted for growth because there's capacity, there's density already there, and there's transit already there. And also around areas where transit is being planned and is currently existing along those kind of linear avenues. So we have them in nodes and corridors, which is a common term that's being used in urbanism across North America with respect to intensification. So now, just to focus a bit on the biggest growth area, which is the downtown, as I said before, it's growing at 4 times the rate of the rest of the city. And you can see in the blue line there where it was 8%, and it's now at 18% growth. And relative to the GTA and relative to the City of Toronto, it's quite a remarkable change. It has doubled in size in the course of about 20 years, and we expect it to double again. This is the downtown in 2002. About, what was that, 14 years ago? And this is the downtown today and with what's approved in terms of construction in the downtown. So people talk about the Manhattanization of the downtown, and it really is true when you see this image. So a lot of these buildings are either in construction or just about to begin construction, the ones that you don't see on the skyline today. So I'll just show you that just again, because it really is a wow image. There. In there, right? So with respect to where this growth is happening and in what form, it's all about urban regeneration. So, and it comes in many forms. We have infill, we have revitalization, we have regeneration of brownfields, for example. We have re-urbanization, particularly of some of the old social housing projects that are now introducing mixed income communities, sustainability, and a bunch of things that weren't thought of back in the 60s when they were built. And we're also talking about retrofitting in suburbia, mostly. So there's a whole retrofit, which I think is really on the horizon more so than it is today, but it's something that we need to look forward to in terms of what changes are happening. And there's a whole list of things that, that relate to that, which are what I'd call challenges. You know, demands for growing population in terms of services and amenities. There's less private space. People are making trade-offs to live in downtown locations. Those trade-offs often mean space in terms of your living space, but also in terms of private amenity space. Backyards and front yards don't exist here. We're talking about a greater emphasis on the public realm, and the common spaces become really important. But we haven't figured that out, or not me, but the politicians and those who are who have the purse strings. And this is one of the big challenges that I'm going to bring up as well. So we have more transit riders. We have a lot more cyclists. Actually, my wife just told me today that cycling. There's been a 30% increase in cyclists in the downtown of going to work. This is people just going to work. So there's been a huge increase. And a great deal of that has to do with some of the success in piloting some dedicated bike lanes. It was a big question mark. We piloted them. They worked really, really well. And so there's a few other things as well. So related to that is some emerging issues that we're now dealing with, and I'll tell you how this might relate to health, is what I'm calling tall and super tall. We're now moving into a range of building heights that we never conceived of just 10 years ago when we created tall building guidelines in Toronto. We were thinking 20, maybe 40 stories, but we're now in the range of 90 and plus stories in terms of proposals. All the proposals in the downtown are well over 40 stories. Very few towers are being proposed of any less than that. This is also an outcome of what I've called in the City of Toronto this juxtaposition between the neighborhoods and the growth areas, because we have wrapped the boundaries so tightly around where growth can go, and we've said absolutely no to growth in the neighborhoods. It has resulted in these kind of extremities that are interesting, and I think we need to grapple with. What I'd call is the missing middle is something that we have to begin to introduce. So with tall, as I said before, we have guidelines. You'll see all the images in the guidelines are buildings in a range of 20 to 30 stories. They're not really grappling with the heights that we're talking about. And a great big issue for us, and these are again the numbers that are really interesting, Toronto relative to all of the other cities has the greatest number of high-rise buildings. This is back in 2011. And the change from January to September in a year jumped. You can see the jump in terms of the numbers just in the course of several months in terms of what's going on. And I just pulled this off one of my favorite websites, Skyscraper resource, but they do really great images, especially if you want to track development. And so I happen to have one from Toronto in 2002, I believe, or 2005, sorry, and then 2016 is just you can see a marked difference, particularly if you look at there's Scotia Tower there, the Scotia Tower there really pops out. You can see that in that course of that time, all of these towers have now been proposed, in addition, not including First Canadian Place, which is that one there. So one of the big issues, and this is not a Toronto-only issue, this is one that I know to some degree in the rest of Canada, we don't see the same level of height issues in Vancouver, for example, because they have very strong policies and controls in Vancouver that they can actually stand behind and hang their shoes on, because in Toronto we have something called the Ontario Municipal Board. And so a lot of what and this goes to the heart of why I'm very interested in our relationship, is that a lot of if most development that requires a rezoning or an official plan amendment in Toronto ends up at the Ontario Municipal Board. It ends up in a quasi-judicial panel of not planners and designers deciding on how the city should be shaped and changed. And so a lot of it is left to the evidence provided in the context of that quasi-judicial board hearing to demonstrate whether something is right or not right in terms of good planning. And so often it's left to the lawyers, and the lawyers who can make the best arguments, and they're usually the best paid ones, and not the city ones are the best paid ones. So we lose almost every time. So anyway, the thing that's important here is for us is that height in it of itself isn't the issue. It's the relationship of the buildings to each other and to the public realm that is the issue for us. So, you know, the separation distances is one that we often focus on between towers. We've just passed a zoning bylaw in the City of Toronto to have a minimum of 25 meter separation between tall buildings. But, you know, in the 30-story range, that might make sense. But in the 90-story range, and you can just model it up, it completely is inadequate. And so the real question for you is, you know, to what degree does matters of light, privacy, view, all of those things matter in terms of health, you know, and that's the kind of thing that we are now beginning to really try to grapple with in terms of making arguments around height and around the relationships of that height to the city around them. So obviously resilience and sustainability is a big trend and a big issue, a big challenge for us, and it's one that is across, certainly across North America, if not the globe. It's being dealt with in a number of different ways. You know, we're seeing environmental impacts where flooding is a serious issue, sea level rise, particularly on the coastal cities, as you know, and more severe weather events. And so there's environmental impacts on us, and then there's our impacts, of course, on the environment, and it's, of course, linked and connected. So, you know, after years and years of you know, debating climate change, it's here. It's here now. And here we are now dealing with issues of resilience. How do we protect ourselves from what climate is about to leash on us for having really hurt her in a big way? So it's really what we're grappling with now. So we're trying to minimize our impact on the environment still, because we're trying to lessen the climate change issue, but at the same time, we're now grappling with climate change and how we actually deal with that with respect to flooding and sea level rise in particular. So there's a whole series of things that we're doing, of course, in the cities that are all particularly public sector-led developments. You know, this is Regent Park. This is one of those mixed income communities that brought down a social project and introduced new development that introduced market housing, and then the city grid once again reintroduced. But what we also see are community gardens. Go back. So what you see here are, there's no laser pointer on this? Yeah, there we go. Community gardens and roof gardens as part of that passive kind of rainwater retention and trying to do its part with respect to minimizing the amount of water that goes into our catch basins. Resilience in around, you know, this is Evergreen. They're centered down in the valley, which floods frequently, and they have a completely different way of designing these places that anticipates flooding on a regular basis. So this kind of planning is very important. And then something on the horizon that is really quite spectacular is the reintroduction of a mouth of a river, and the Don River in Toronto is a river that has been completely modified by humans, but and it has issues around flooding that are quite severe, and we've introduced some significant flood controls, but the last phase of that work is going to be to actually reintroduce the mouth. Right now it comes at a 90-degree angle. Of course, nature doesn't work that way, and so we're reintroducing it in the context of redeveloping the Portlands in the city. The waterfront here is the largest waterfront regeneration project in the world right now, and it's massive. This will be introduced as part of a neighborhood redevelopment. Transit, of course, is a really big trend and an important one. It's goes part and parcel with the whole intensification strategy. Toronto is a ridiculous context in terms of dealing with transit. I mean, our politicians are constantly arguing about subway, not our subway, LRT, where should it go? You know, now we're proposing a several kilometer underground subway to one stop. I mean, it's just ridiculous political decision making without the evidence to prove what is good and not good. This city in the suburban areas is really, from a political perspective, they want subways. And they want subways because they are faster, but that's not what they want subways for, because they don't want transit getting in the way of their congested roads. That's why they want subways. They don't want LRT because it's going to get in the way of their driving. That is what, so the thing is, some of these decisions shouldn't be left to four-year-term politicians, because it's not about them. This stuff, by the time it gets invested and built, it's actually about their children and their children's children. So people need to think a little bit from well, the planners often are the only ones thinking about things in generational terms. But anyhow, this is a really great quote from the mayor of Bogota. You know, a developed country is not a place where the poor have cars, it's where the rich use transit. And it's a really, you know, a good mantra to have. So here we have Toronto's transit today, subways and rapid transits, including GO, which is the commuter rail line, as well as LRT. This is what's being planned in next year, 6 years. We have a lot of catching up to do, clearly. We have a city that is growing leaps and bounds, about 30,000 people a year, and yet we don't have the transit infrastructure to support it. It's really reaching its breaking point. And in large part, the downtown growth also has to do with the fact that out of frustration, people just don't want to do the commuting, and there's no transit either to help them. So walking is what it's all about, and that's the way most people get about in the downtown. So so that's the next 6 years, and then through the 6 to 15 years, you can see an extraordinary amount of investment going into transit in the billions and billions of dollars. That we have a lot of catching up to do, as I said, and so that is going to shape urbanism in a big way because it's really about the infrastructure. The nodes around the station, every one of those stations becomes an opportunity to direct growth to those places. And so it's about integrating those developments in a way that is not going to destabilize the adjacent neighborhoods, but it's also about kind of decentralizing a lot of that growth in a way that is more healthy. And in the act of doing that, neighborhoods in the suburban areas, because the counterpoint to the downtown growth is that our suburban areas, there's been a reverse migration of wealth. So the suburban areas are actually suffering. They're in decline. They're not the places where people want to be. And I'm talking about the kind of inner outer ring, because in the inner ring of suburban areas, which were the old streetcar suburbs, which were on the grid still, they're actually still very attractive places, and they're where a lot of the millennials are going, because the downtown is a bit unaffordable for them. But then just on the outside of that, where you start to get into the cul-de-sacs and the spaghetti roads, that's where it's problematic, and that's where the congestion is, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the decline. And so with transit and bringing mobility out to those folks, and the development that comes with it, although they will kick and scream against it, it's in their best interest, of course, because we're going to be introducing housing that will allow them to live in their neighborhoods through all stages of their lives. It will introduce a critical mass of people that you need to support amenities and services and retail that make those suburban areas more attractive to the new generation. So it is what it is. And this is the kind of development that we're talking about, what we call TOD, or transit-oriented development, around stations. It's denser, it introduces a variety of different housing types, and it also creates that critical mass. Suburban retrofitting, a really big kind of area, I think, on the horizon, and will come with transit and a whole host of other interventions that will be necessary to now bring wealth and growth and interest back into suburbia. I never thought I'd be saying this 10 years ago, but that's the case. So here we have just the cost to a municipality. I'm sorry, I can't tell you the source of this right now, but to the municipality on average per household, and this is just about a comparative study of delivering on services, roads, all of that is about $1,400 per person relative to the suburban context of $3,400. So the cost of delivering and services and to actually sustain these places is just not there. So what is suburban retrofitting? We're talking about this is that spaghetti road system along a major arterial where transit is likely to be introduced in LRT form. And in that case, how do people get to that transit? They can't, because we have what we call reverse lot frontage. So you have, we've treated our arterial roads not like main streets in the traditional city. We've treated them like funnels for traffic. They're a single-use, functional, utilitarian idea, as opposed to this notion of streets as space and place that is public realm that includes everything. So we're, of course, stuck in a situation where we have these reverse lot frontage, and this will be the challenge of the next 10 years, in my opinion. How do we demonstrate to this neighborhood that this is good for them? The evidence behind that to create a neighborhood that is not walkable, one that is going to be walkable, that you can protect, for the most part, the low-density single-family home, but the ones that are running along the fringes here are going to have to transition into something that is more that's got more porosity, that is more walkable, and that can actually support higher density development and retail and all the things that transit needs to make it work. And then, of course, we have suburban retrofitting in the neighborhoods where we begin to infill even within neighborhoods in more modest and sensitive ways. We also have suburban retrofitting along our avenues, we call in Toronto, but this is typical of a corridor redevelopment that occurs across North America, usually in conjunction with transit again. So this would be a commercial strip, and of course what we're seeing now is kind of a retrofitting of that to make it into a mixed-use corridor that supports the transit investment happening here as well. And what we're seeing a lot of in Toronto in particular is what we call, we have suburban apartment neighborhoods. It's again typical of suburban development where everything's in pods of uses and pods of housing types and pods of retail and office and industrial. Everything's separated out. Is that these pods of high-density development, which are usually rental housing, we're going through this whole what we call tower renewal process, where we're actually reinvesting in these towers they're nearing their lifespan, the end of their lifespan, so they need to be renovated and retrofitted, and in the money, the revenue that's going to come from is going to be in actually infilling. So the infilling gives us an opportunity to take what were tower and park forms, which are just basically towers swimming in lots of green space that's unusable and nobody really cares about, to more denser forms, but ones that are more street-related and that introduce opportunities for retail and all the kind of things that you have at the street level that is actually vibrant and safe and secure because it has eyes on the space and all the things that Jane Jacobs talks about. So that's actually happening. This is a rendering, but it's actually almost completed. I didn't have any photographs of it. And this is kind of the tower in a park idea, swimming in parking lots, and then kind of the idea of infilling, particularly with different forms of housing to introduce that kind of variety in the neighborhood. And then also suburban retrofitting in our kind of highway kind of space is endless, and we can do, engineers can do anything that they want kind of scenario to one that is more kind of mindful of land consumption. So this is not a highway. This is an intersection of 3 roads, and which in any other logical city might be a roundabout or maybe a four kind of an operation around the traffic lights so that you can actually sequence it. But oh no, it had to be on non-stop traffic, and there was no way anyone was going to be slowed down by a minute or two. So again, it's just a shift in thinking that's going on. So this is the 6 points, and what you see in the red outline is the existing interchange of these 3 intersecting roads, and then in green is the new configuration that actually brings it down. It's come to its the shelf life, end of its shelf life, and rather than renovate it, we're taking it down and reintroducing a block and streets that are walkable, and sorry, that's upside down. And in the context of doing that, introducing a new civic center and a new development that is complementary of what is one of the sub-centers in Toronto. It's called the Tobico Center, in the same way that Brentwood or Surrey Centre and those places in Vancouver exist. So complete streets is another big trend. How do we take these utilitarian streets, and I think one of the biggest inspirations for us has been, of course, New York and what they've done in terms of introducing it first as a pilot where they've carved out space out of the roadway and gave it back to the pedestrians, which are the far bigger majority of people on the streets. So really, Complete Streets is about rebalancing the use of this finite public realm, which is the street, and reintroducing the place scenario, not just the link scenario of a street. And how do you actually create places? So all of this was done with paint and planting pots, really. And in some cases, like Times Square, it's now worked so successfully that they're actually now replacing that paint with granite. They're turning it into real and enduring public spaces. So Complete Streets, we're introducing that scenario. Toronto just developed guidelines for Complete Streets, and they'll be made public soon. That is about carving out space for cyclists and pedestrians and transit in balance with vehicles. It's not about the war on the vehicle, it's just about finding a better balance between all of these. And in some cases, Toronto hasn't been as brave enough as Vancouver has, for example, with respect to actually prioritizing. They've actually come out and said, we're going to prioritize who's most important in the street. Starting with pedestrian, followed by the cyclist, followed by the transit user, followed by delivery trucks, and somewhere at the bottom is a car, the personal car. It's not the #1 priority. So if push comes to shove, and we have to make a decision. Where is that decision going to go? It's going to be based on the priorities. Well, we haven't done that yet in Toronto, and there is a very strong political mentality and a mindset out here that isn't prepared to make those choices yet. But we're going to have to do it soon. Creative spacing. This is the Times Square in New York that I talked about. That's now turned into a granite space, and there's been some tremendous success from an economic development perspective. But when I talk about creative spacing, all of this density comes with more people, but we don't actually sometimes have the open space to support it, the public space. We can't afford to actually, at the escalating, appreciating cost of property, to actually acquire that property, even with all of the park levies that we collect in some of the cities. So we have to get more creative on how we use our public space that's already in public ownership, like streets, and found spaces. And this is what I'm showing you here. So these are parklets. I know they exist in places across from Halifax to Vancouver, and they're not a new idea. How we turn roadways into shared spaces. So this is in front of Union Station, where in the summer, especially, they pull out the patios and they actually use the space. It's shared because pedestrians and cars both use it, but they also can close it off, so it's a multi-use space during events and festivals. In Montreal, the Rue de St. Catharines, or St. Catharines Street, which is like their Yonge Street or their Granville, is, thank you, is a recent redo where they've created a flush street condition. And again, something in Toronto is certainly not ready to do yet. No, we're just starting to think about this stuff. But in St. Catharines, it is basically in the Place des Arts, the area, they're calling it the Quartier du Spectacle, which is where basically the entertainment district. And in here, this is where the jazz festival occurs and all of the festivals, it's the city of festivals, Montreal. And they closed the street off without even thinking about it. And they now created the environment to enable that to happen seamlessly. In Quebec City, really interesting, this notion of flex street, the ability to, in the winter months, it's cold, there's no pedestrians to speak of in the same, to the same degree that they have during the summer months when the patios are full, and so the street shrinks during the summer, and then it expands during the winter months. And what you see are the bollards here, the bollards that actually move in the winter months to this location. But in the summer months, they pull out and they occupy this. So this actually here is a travel lane. It's an actual travel lane. And in other cities around the world, Madrid taking down its freeway, replacing it with parks, Seoul, South Korea, we're taking it down entirely and reintroducing daylighting its river. Boston, the Big Dig, very expensive, but in the fullness of time will certainly pay its dividends and become a return on investment. In San Francisco, the Acadero Freeway, which has come down. So we have freeways going down all over the world, except in Toronto. We just decided to spend $1.5 billion the future generations will be paying for to keep up our freeway. Excuse me. I'm just getting over a cold, and it's coming back to haunt me now. The Highliner in New York, taking an older piece of infrastructure, which is the rail line, of course, and turning that into a wonderful park, which is actually completely catalyzing that part of the lower west side, which is Chelsea and the Village, completely catalyzing the redevelopment, the revitalization of that area. We have what we call Underpass Park here in Toronto, which we've also occupied, and we also have something called Under the Gardiner. It's called the Bentway now, which is going to be taking all of this wasted space underneath the Gardiner that is not being utilized and utilizing it as event spaces and other forms of recreation. And now, recently announced, and I can toot my own horn and say this was my idea, that there is a point in the downtown where we can't afford the park acquisitions, but we can actually build a decking over the rail line. And this isn't a new idea. It's been done in Millennium Park in Chicago and in Melbourne and a few other places. And in that decking, the cost of the decking and actually creating a park and resulting in a 22-acre park here in this location is actually flush in terms of cost as it would be to acquire that land. But there isn't 22 acres to acquire anyway. But if there was 22 acres to acquire, and that's today's dollars, but jump ahead 10 years from now, and that will actually be a lot cheaper than the land prices. And this is just an image of what that might look like. So, those are some of the trends. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I call the new 21st century urbanism. All of this, what does all of this mean with respect to what we're trying to aspire to, which we are in many cases, and there are evidence of these kind of developments that exist, you know, despite all of the criticism of Olympic Village in Vancouver. It's a spectacular example of urbanism, in my opinion, mid-rise urbanism. And there are other places, especially like in Montreal, and what we're seeing particularly around the Lachine Canal, for example, and in little pockets of cities across the country. There are these great examples of 21st century urbanism. So what is that? There's five what I call important themes, and none of them should be new to you. I'm sorry, I'm really coughing here. Just give me a second. You guys can read while I'm taking a drink. Actually, I have one. There we go. So hopefully that works. So I don't need to read this. I think you guys can all get it, but for the most part, I've talked about green, I've talked about walkable. The contextual is an important one. The idea that in building or regenerating, because much of 21st century urbanism is actually not about greenfield, it's about how we actually regenerate existing urban areas. And so it's complex, and it's actually very challenging, and we're constantly facing NIMBY and politicians who don't want to make hard decisions. And it's a very contentious way to develop, except unless it's, of course, brownfields or gray fields or, you know, old commercial areas or dying malls. They're always wonderful and easy places to develop, but when it comes to adjacent to neighborhoods or along the avenues where transit is going, it's very contentious. And so being contextual and finding ways to fit in a way that doesn't take away but actually adds a positive results to the neighborhood is very important. The notion of flexibility, I showed you all that kind of creative spacing, particularly in winter climates. We have to find ways to make better utilization of our public investments. And so whether it's public space or civic buildings, and this goes to the heart of the notion, one of the issues I'll bring up with you later, which is the closure of schools in our urban areas. Here we are growing leaps and bounds in the center of cities, and that's exactly where school boards want to close their schools, just as we're beginning to see a baby boom. So there's this disconnect between formulas that the provincial governments provide cities with respect to funding and at odds with other policies at the provincial level, which is about intensification. Things like that are just beyond us. So why can't those schools, which are very expensive properties in the downtown core, for example, can't be flexible and maybe readapted until enrollment builds up again? They're not resources that we should be getting rid of, just as an example. Diverse is about mixed use, and it's about diversity of a whole range of things, from housing to uses, and that's the kind of thing that we need to be introducing in urbanism. What is the new urban design agenda? Is basically how do we achieve those things? What are the kind of the shift in thinking that needs to occur for us to create a 21st century urbanism? The first is that we have to, for the last 60 years, we have been focused on a very different scale. That scale has been the automobile, in terms of scale of streets, in terms of the scale of places and locations and distances. All of it has been focused around a very different element, and we got to get back to the scale of the human. So the human scale is something that we're trying to reintroduce in our talks and in our guidelines. And when we do that, when we think about the human perspective in terms of measure, but also in terms of experience, if that becomes the barometer for success, everything falls into place. Everything from microclimates and how we deal with building impacts on the street to the design of storefronts. When you start to design to the human being, a whole bunch of issues get resolved immediately. So it's really about changing our perspective and our barometer for measure. The public realm, particularly given the densities that we're seeing, has to be our #1 priority. It can't be, it is always the first thing to get cut in budgets. It's always the last thing to be thought of. It's always about window dressing. It's not real meaningful change. And so when we begin to think about how we can better utilize and multi-purpose these spaces, but also invest the proper amounts of money into them with respect to tree planting. We in Toronto are willing to plant a twig of a tree and replant it every 2 years because it's not surviving. I mean, it's absurd thinking that's going on there when we should be properly giving the soil volumes and the water irrigation, all the things that a tree needs to survive. It's expensive at the outset, but it's in the long-term benefits are extraordinary. And so we can't seem to make those arguments compellingly enough. So that kind of thinking needs to happen. Oh shit, I forgot to delete that image. Okay, so authentic and character-driven placemaking, I talked about this. We have to, particularly when when we're doing urbanism that's about regeneration, we can't do away with our heritage. We can't do away with all the things that actually make place and actually create a kind of distinction and a memorable and livable place. And so the notion of placemaking that is character-driven is very important. The other thing that we're grappling with is that sometimes we overplan things. Urban complexity has merits to it. It creates a kind of, there's a collision of people and ideas and things that are happening that is actually healthy. And then, and there's also a messy part of it, right? So we have to figure out how we control and tame the messy part without doing away with the merits and the good stuff that comes with complexity. So, for example, we need to kind of embrace, we need to embrace an idea around form-based codes as an example. So rather than over-zoning things and shrink-wrapping everything, maybe we need a little bit more of a looser interpretation of form to allow a variety of uses to exist. Because one of the things that we're grappling with in urban centers, particularly in growth centers where we're trying to introduce mixed use, is that none of the permits and the way in which tax is collected and the way in which things are zoned actually permits that dynamic use condition that we used to have on main streets in the prior to contemporary urbanism. So we have to start to think about how that complexity is enabled. And then a lot of this has to do with education and research and evidence-based research as well. How do we nurture a culture or a sensibility around good urbanism? So people actually are, it's a demand of the public, right? How do we make them be up front and center in terms of compelling politicians to invest appropriately in what needs to be invested and to make the right decisions? So a lot of it is about education. So that brings me to the last few slides, which is about what I call the challenges that intersect with public health. I'm making an attempt here. I don't know for sure. Fear and loathing of density is one that we are trying to grapple with. There's good and there's bad density, and I'm just going to give you some examples. So in Toronto, we have 6,000 people per square kilometer. You know, and some people think that's really dense. But you go to New York, and we're talking about 10,000 people per square kilometer. And if you've been to New York, but it's not bad. It's working pretty good. I like New York. And then one of my favorite places is Paris, 21,000 people per square kilometer. We're talking densities that are well over what we expect in Toronto. But you know, nobody hates Paris. And it's probably one of the most civilized cities I've ever been to. I've been there maybe 11, 12 times. And I just go there to hang out. I actually don't go there to see the landmarks anymore. I just go to actually live like a Parisian. Just my wife and I go, we park ourselves in one of the neighborhoods. We take one of those Airbnb apartments, and we just be Parisian for a week. We can't speak French. But we enjoy just living. We go shopping, we pick up our baguettes, we just live like Parisians, and then of course we come back here. But the point is that there's something that works at this density. All of the shops are independent shops. I mean, sure, they have the big national brands and all that, but this is a density where you have variety and choice and an extraordinary social life and street life, and everything is just working. It's functioning. And I was actually in Barcelona this summer, and it's exactly the same thing. Nothing doesn't work in Barcelona. Everything works. In fact, it works even better than Paris. It's annoyingly perfect. They've barred, what do you call it? Jesus, what's that car share? Airbnb, what's the other one? Okay, Uber, thank you. So they've banned Uber there, and I asked why, and it's because the taxis would be willing to meet the price range that the Uber, and they'd provide the exact same. The transit works. I've never been stuck in a traffic jam and a peak hour in Barcelona. It's the densities that are similar to Paris. So it's a city that it's amazingly dense and amazingly functional, amazingly clean. And now they're introducing all these other things that are creating these super blocks, closing off cars altogether in some cases. Anyhow, the point is that we have a lot of work to do in our cities in North America towards achieving kind of a pinnacle of civility and urbanism. But there is a sphere of loathing of density here that is, I think, misplaced. And it's really about understanding what density is and that it comes in many forms and that's not all bad. So trying to understand what the triggers for bad density is. At which point does density become bad? Is it a quantity, or is it a form and a kind of shape? And this goes also back to the point I was bringing up about tall buildings. We have a sense that it's better to pull those buildings apart because it gives people a sense of space in their own living environments. But is tall buildings altogether just not the right way to go? I mean, do people have more health issues, depression issues if they're in taller buildings? Are they more disconnected socially in tall buildings? There's a debate going on about tall versus mid-rise in this city right now. Are there health implications to view, light, and air privacy? Those things are, we, from an urban design perspective, talk about it all the time, but we haven't been able to talk about it from a health perspective. And what can dense environments do to mitigate implications? So, in Paris, it's very dense. People have very small apartments, but they have these splendid public spaces. They're just splendid, and they are beautiful places, and they're constantly in shadow in many cases. They don't always have a lot of privacy. I'm just trying to grapple with why it works in some contexts and why it doesn't in ours. So far, for me, the big kind of the unifying or equalizer tends to be the public realm. If we can do the public realm really, really well, it seems to make all the nasty stuff go away. So that brings me to the next themed area, which is valuing the public realm. It's always compelling to see the before and after, but once the after is in, people forget. They don't see urban design or the quality of the public realm in the same way that urbanists do, because we look for those things, right? They just see the whole package. It's a feeling. Like my wife says, I don't want to drive down that road, please. Can we just take another route? And I said, well, why? Well, it just doesn't make me feel right. So she's talking about a road in Toronto. It's called Bathurst. It's a terrible street. It's nothing. It's a nondescript street, but it has nothing beautiful about it. Nothing. So my wife is willing to take a different route when we're heading out to see to her parents, for example, up north. We will have to take a different route that actually feels better. It just puts a smile on her face. And I know that today there are ways in which we can measure emotional response to environments, and so maybe that becomes a really important factor in terms of creating place and the quality and investments that we make in place. Just examples of before and afters. I mean, this is when I was at the City of Toronto, we had a $5 million budget to spend on piggybacking on transportation projects, for example, and adding some trees and putting in some grass. But the difference it makes is remarkable. We're talking pennies in the bucket relative to what the transportation budget of that particular project was. It's just a little slap on the top, but it's the one that actually makes the most impact for people. But no one's really measuring that. So anyhow, from day one, I said $5 million. $5 million relative to almost a $900 million budget for transportation, down including water and all the other big divisions. So and this was being asked to slash. They want to slash this part of the budget. So I thought it was going insane because I was thinking to myself, well, what if not this, what do people measure the success of the political decision-making, if not something that really affects them in a more real way? Sure, water is important, sure, electricity is important, all that stuff, and it directly impacts you, but I don't think it has anything to do with happiness. Anyway, that's the other thing, happiness. What measure of happiness is there? So valuing the public realm, we've been able, and I'm sorry the slides are mixed up here because of the translation of typeface, but anyhow, there's been a significant investment made in the public realm in Toronto on Bloor Street, which is the premier, where all the boutiques and high-end European stores are. The BIA paid for this, the business improvement area, not the city. The city refused to put any dollar into this. $20 million, which was loaned to them by the city, and they're not paying back. But the city would have made its money back had it invested in just a 5-year period, just in property tax increases. The lease rates went up, the rents went up, the amount of sales went up, everything went up. It was an extraordinary economic development initiative, not just a beautification initiative. But that's not even measuring health. We're not even getting to the degree of happiness. So is there a correlation between the quality of public realm and health? Is quality more important than quantity? Should the amount invested in public realm have a proportional relationship to the amount of development density? One would think that they should go step in step, but my thinking is that with greater density, you might actually want to increase, it might be a little bit that you actually have to accelerate and increase the proportion of public realm spending. Inclusivity of all places is another themed area. I mentioned this in the downtown area where you're seeing schools closing, and it's a desperate attempt to try and keep them open. A lot of it has to do with the fact that these schools are big, they're generous halls, they're older schools, so the funding formula doesn't match up with the fact that they're older buildings, and so it's actually cheaper to close them down and build a newer school, a big mega school somewhere else that you bus all the kids to. So we have this issue around school closures in the fastest growing parts of the city. We have accommodating families in multifamily housing. There's this perception that children don't belong downtown. Well, tough, it's happening. We can't make those choices. People, younger people, particularly in my age group in the 43 range, they are choosing to have children. In fact, we moved into a condominium about 5 years ago in the King West area of Toronto. It's a new building, and a lot of people in our age group moved in as well. We had people, two people on our floor who were a couple, and by the time we had moved out of that building 3 or 4 years later, both of them had one had 3 children, and the other couple had 2 children in the course of that time. They didn't move out. They were lofts. They weren't even demarcated rooms in this building. So they refused to move to a suburban location until the housing that actually was what they wanted, which is maybe a townhouse or a kind of ground-related unit in the downtown core. They did not want to leave the downtown. So we have to find ways to accommodate that, not to mention senior citizens. And I'll show you a statistic in a minute about that. The last issue is what I call reconciling scales, which is about an issue around how we've planned and designed everything to the vehicle, and we have to shift that around. And this is a statistic from yesterday, Tuesday, December 6th, between 4:30 p.m. and 6:30 a.m., 1 cyclist and 24 pedestrians were hit in Toronto roads in the course of yesterday in that period of time. And we had one death, a fatality of an 87-year-old, but that was the 76th traffic fatality in Toronto this year, and 42 of which were senior citizens. So we're having a problem here. We have an aging population, and we have a really massacre going on our streets across North America. It's not just Toronto. And something's got to give. We just don't give the same degree of care or sense of crisis around the number of deaths related to fatalities on the streets that we do to other things, including 9/11. I mean, it's crazy. So an important issue, and this is enemy number one, believe it or not. And this is one of the biggest things that we are really stuck on. How do you fight the fire department who wants big trucks and wide roads when those big trucks and wide roads are actually causing more deaths than fires? It's a strange dichotomy where we're actually in a situation where the ones coming up against all of the road dieting and all of the kind of intensification efforts that we're doing is EMS. And so why can't they buy the narrow European trucks? Given that 80% of the calls that they make are not fire related. They're physical health issues, heart attacks, a stroke. It's not fire. So anyway, we need your help on that one. So, other impacts, again, this is about downscaling EMS, slowing traffic down, narrowing roadways to save lives. That's what we're trying to get to. Sorry, that took a little longer than I expected. No, that coughing didn't help. Anyway, thank you. And this is... So a conversation has to be had about what I call the crisis of civic obligation, which doesn't, our utilities, hydro, we have wooden poles. Have you noticed all the wooden poles out there on our streets? Toronto Hydro, which is now on a cost-cutting measure. They actually came back to the city and said, we don't want to pay, it's part of our contract, and their reading of the contract, because they took over lighting in the city, they don't want to pay for the pedestrian lighting anymore. They don't think it's considered roadway lighting. So they're now abdicating the responsibility to pay for pedestrian lighting, which was clearly part of the lighting system or network they adopted. But just as an example of our utility companies, with their blinders on, not understanding their role as part of the civic involvement. They occupy a huge part of our public realm, but they don't think of themselves as anything but lighting and hydro. But they're actually players and responsible participants in the civic realm. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but there's an obligation for us, for companies and organizations that occupy the public realm to be held to a different level of expectation. That's what I'm saying. And we used to think that way. We used to not have to have rules or even have to say that. People kind of stepped up in the past, but they don't step up anymore. It's all about the bottom line now, right? Yeah.
Thanks. A different perspective maybe, but you talked about sort of the whole idea of urban planning, and I've recently, well, 2 points. One is that every building we build today basically is going to influence our carbon footprint for the next 50 to 60 years on average. And the other thing is that I was in Japan recently and also in China, and they're talking about basically ripping their cities apart and creating these corridors of tall buildings, then spaces into green space, medium buildings, back up to tall ones, and then a whole series of them going inland, for example, from the ocean to catch the sea breeze, right? So that carbon footprint relates to how you're going to cool and heat your buildings, all that other stuff. So what about, and then in China, they actually, we just found this out, but they want to use some methodologies we created to actually look at every 100 cities, and they want to completely change the architecture of the city or the design so they can ventilate the city, which means basically ripping down corridors throughout the cities. So this is, you know, they claim they're going to do this in a year, although I have to see what happens.
They'll do it in 2.
But there's this regional piece there that relates to climate change, I think, in terms of both mitigation of energy consumption, but also related to, you know, it's going to get warmer, and if you pack all these buildings in here when people got nowhere to go to cool off, how are you going to deal with that?
That's a great question. There's a well, first of all, I mean, if we could have the same kind of controls and not being subject to the processes of consultation and all the things that China has to do, that doesn't have to do. You know, there you have the resources and the kind of the jurisdiction, we'll say, to do those sorts of things. What's amazing about China also is that in a matter of, they've almost been on like a, they have kind of experienced everything that we've experienced in the developed world over the course of 200 years. They're experiencing in a generation. They're going from unbridled development completely through and past us into completely sustainable development. It's amazing. They've done a complete 180. And they'll do it. They'll implement it. They're going to implement the technology. We'll be learning from them in terms of them leading, in terms of sustainable development. We have our access to cheap energy for so long has, I think, resulted in kind of a real kind of approach to city building and to buildings, in particular building practices, that has really been not very responsible in that sense. But we in the downtown Toronto, which are doing for the first time in 30, 40 years, a downtown comprehensive plan that will actually explore, and this is the trigger. The trigger has been, we don't actually have the hard services to support all of this development. The lights just went off, and all of these towers are being proposed, but we actually may not even have water capacity. I mean, somebody wasn't thinking. So that's planning's fault, not urban design's fault, because planning, at the time that the official plan in Toronto was created that generated a lot of this development, they took away densities, they took away all the controls to try and incentivize intensification. Well, now that we've far surpassed what we anticipated, I think we're trying to pull the reins back now. And this TO Core study is going to look at how to not only deal with the service side of things, but actually minimize the demand side. And so to do that, buildings need to generate less energy needs, and then we have to also retrofit buildings. So there's a whole new kind of exploration going on in the downtown around that. But there is also new technology, and I'm sorry to mention Stantec again, but I've just been amazed by some of this information. They have now developed in Stantec, they have a sustainability group. They have actually been working on creating a net zero carbon footprint type building that actually is comparable now to construct and price to any other normal cost building. That means the issue around affordability gap is diminished. We're now at a point where we can actually develop buildings that have no carbon footprint for almost the same price as any other, but why would we do it any other way? I mean, it just should just become policy that we just do it, because so much of our energy consumption is around buildings, operating them, constructing them, demolishing them. I mean, so retrofitting, adaptive reuse, all of that needs to be thought of. And when we build buildings today, we need to build them not just for we build throwaway buildings in suburbia, you know, the Walmarts and all that. They actually don't last more than 20 years. That kind of thinking has to go away, and we need to start thinking, like I work in a building that is 150 years old. Before we moved in, it was a sock factory, McGregor Socks, and it's a spectacular, beautiful brick and beam building, but it could be anything. That's amazing that it's a building that was built to last hundreds of years, and it could be anything. It could be renovated and so how much are we saving in terms of energy costs just around adaptive reuse is a really interesting question to ask. Anyway, good point about building services. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, thank you.
Harold, thank you very much for just a perfect talk for us to open up our opening meeting with the CANUE Consortium for dinner. So eye-opening to see what can be there in the future, and I want to fast forward and see all this happen. But I know it takes a long time, and there's so many difficult decisions to be made. And we certainly hope that health can become much more of the equation going forward, and we hope that you'll stay engaged with us in CANUE. We're starting out. There's lots of energy and excitement here, and so I really do appreciate you taking time to come and talk with us, and hopefully this will be the beginning of some more communication we can have down the road. So, a small gift for you to thank you for coming.
Very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I just have one more thing to say. I promise this is it, because you reminded me. You reminded me of this. We really do need to stay connected. That I didn't know enough about you, that I didn't even know you were a resource that was out there, is unfortunate. And it may not be because you're not making yourself aware. It could be that I'm just clueless. But I think you're vital. You're a vital part of the whole initiative around creating better living environments for people. It's not just about building, it's about creating better places for us to live as human beings, and our happiness and our health. And so I would like, if any of you are not sitting on organizations related to planning, I'm happy to participate with your group, and vice versa. If we can get you guys sitting on CIP and OPPI and especially CANUE, which is also, we have a CANUE called Canadian Urbanism, Society for Urbanism, it would be great. And if anybody's interested, please reach out to me, and I'd love to introduce you and bring you into that organization. It's a cross-country organization that deals with urbanism, and it's multidisciplinary. We have planners, urban designers, landscape architects, engineers, transportation, and we're missing public health as an important input. Yeah. Thank you.